Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about the plasma membrane. Hopefully you have your iPads out with your cell notes open. I'm starting on slide 10 of 29, so please make sure that you've got your notes ready to go. You'll be in the computer lab at the end of class today working through what we call the plasma membrane game. I'll show you what that is on a link from Canvas excuse me, here in just a minute. So on slide 10, you should see, your screen should look like mine, and we're going to be talking about the cell structure called the plasma membrane. Now, the plasma membrane is not just the cell membrane. So notice here it describes it as a thin, flexible boundary between the cell and its environment. But plasma membranes are not just found on the outside or sort of surrounding the outer edges of a cell. In eukaryotic cells, like what we described last class, we actually have plasma membranes located throughout the cell. So this same structure is what makes up the boundary between the internal environment of the nucleus and the external environment of the cytoplasm in the cell, as well as the internal environment of the mitochondria and the cytoplasm of the cell. So these plasma membranes, like what you see depicted here, are found throughout the eukaryotic cell. In every case, they are in fact a thin and flexible boundary between either the internal part of the cell or organelle and its external environment. And the important features of these plasma membranes is that they allow nutrients to pass into the cell and waste to pass out of the cell. So they're incredibly important for maintaining cell homeostasis by allowing correct nutrients like water and oxygen in and getting potentially fatal toxins out of the cell. So we're going to take a look at four major structures that make up this plasma membrane and how those structures work together to perform a characteristic for the cell called selective permeability. Permeability is the ability to pass through a substance, and this idea of being selective means that this cell membrane is able to choose what substances can pass through and which substances can't. So for instance, the cell membrane is really responsible for identifying and allowing important nutrients like oxygen, water, and glucose to pass into the cell, while at the same time it's just as important for it to be able to remove wastes like carbon dioxide. And yes, in some cases we do need to get rid of excess water. Too much water inside our cells can be really bad for us. Right? So taking a closer look at the plasma membrane, the bulk, the majority of the plasma membrane is made up of this molecule that we should recognize from our last unit, the phospholipid. This was one of the major polymers of lipids that we talked about in our last unit. And the plasma membrane is described as being a phospholipid bilayer. So that prefix bi, hopefully we remember, means two, because every phospholipid has two layers, a top layer and a bottom layer, or more specifically what we would call the outside layer, which would be whatever comes up against either the external environment of the cell or the cytoplasm of the cell if we're talking about a plasma membrane that surrounds a particular organelle, and then the inside layer, right, which is up against the inside or the cytoplasm of the cell or the inside of the organelle. All right, so these phospholipid bilayers are made up of many, many phospholipids. You can see them here. So here's one, then the next one, then the next one. So lots and lots of phospholipids all collected together to make these sort of sheets of phospholipids. And again, here we have a review of the basic structure of a phospholipid. So remember that phospholipids contain that polar head. So we called it the hydrophilic head because it was polar, right? And those fatty acid nonpolar tails. So the polar head is really all of this. The glycerol molecule, which you can see here, the phosphate group, and then what we call the polar group. So all of this together makes up what we would call that hydrophilic, water-loving, polar phospholipid head. And then these down here are those fatty acid tails, right? So there's where we get that basic structure from, where we have a head with two fatty acid tails. And hopefully you can see that over here in our structure of our plasma membrane. Right? So phospholipids make up the bulk of the plasma membrane. But in the plasma membrane, we don't just have phospholipids, right? So again, here we can see each one of those phospholipids. There's bottom layer, there's top layer, but we also have several other components. So we have proteins, like this channel protein. We have cholesterol, which is this little orange guy that's sort of embedded in those phospholipids. And we have carbohydrate chains. Here's one, right? And these molecules seem to sort of float within the plasma membrane. So we describe the plasma membrane as having what we call a fluid mosaic. Fluid, because the membrane acts more like a liquid than a solid, which we're going to learn is a really important component of our plasma membranes, right? And mosaic, because there's many things sort of all collected together in a little mosaic tapestry. Right, so we need to understand the function of each one of those mosaic particles. Starting with proteins, if you recall from our discussion of proteins in our last unit over macromolecules, we said that proteins have a lot of different functions. So the same thing is true of the proteins found in our cell membrane. Some of them are responsible for transmitting signals throughout the cell. Some of them act as a support, so they provide structural support for the cell. But the ones that we're going to focus on in this particular chapter are the transport proteins. So transport proteins provide pathways for substances to enter and leave the cell. Here's a really great example of a transport protein. Right now, they're not any more or less important than those signaling proteins or the structural support proteins, but we are going to spend quite a bit of time talking about cell transport. How do we get molecules from one side of the cell to the other side of the cell? And these transport proteins are incredibly important for that. So we're going to focus on two types of transport proteins, and you're going to see them today in your activity in the computer lab. One is called a channel protein, and the other is called a carrier protein. Right, so be on the lookout for those in your activity that you'll do in the computer lab in just a minute. Right, so in addition to our proteins, we also have a molecule called cholesterol inside of our cell membranes. Now, cholesterol, there is a good and a bad cholesterol. So I'm sure you guys have heard, your doctors or your parents' doctors talk about, watch your cholesterol, or you've heard commercials. But this cholesterol is actually the good kind of cholesterol, the kind that we need, because it's responsible for stabilizing our cell membranes. You can actually see the cholesterol right here. It's embedded right in between those fatty acid tails of some of those phospholipids. And its big job is to prevent those fatty acid tails from sticking together. So remember that we talked about saturated fatty acids tend to be able to group together really, really tightly, and at room temperature, they're solids. I hope that you can understand why having a solid cell membrane might be bad for living things. Imagine trying to pass through a door, a solid wooden door that's closed, not open, closed. It's almost impossible to pass through that solid wooden door. Certainly impossible without hurting yourself. But if you replaced that solid wooden door with a wall of water, right, then it's relatively easy to pass through that wall of water and get from one side to the other. Right, so that's very similar to what cholesterol does for the cell membrane. By embedding itself inside these phospholipid fatty acid tails, it prevents them from sticking together, allowing the plasma membrane to remain fluid. Okay, not solid, fluid. And this is going to allow things to pass in and out of the cell the way that they're supposed to. Right? And then finally, we have carbohydrate chains. Carbohydrate chains are those sugar chains. So these are chains of those carbon ring structures that we talked about last unit, right? And their big job is to help us to identify chemical signals between cells. The big role here is identifying what type of cell you're looking at. So we call it cell identity. Okay, cell identity. And in the activity that you guys do in the lab today, you're going to see that these carbohydrate chains are really important for our immune system. Our immune system cells go through and they're constantly looking for things that don't belong inside our body, viruses, bacteria, fungus, things of that nature. And they identify their presence because those things don't have the same carbohydrate chains that we have on the surface of our cells. So it helps us to identify cells that belong to us versus cells that really shouldn't be there, or particles that shouldn't be there that the immune system needs to get rid of. Right? Finally, on this last screen, you have a link to a YouTube video that will review the structure and function of these 4 major components of our plasma membrane. But what I'd like for you guys to do now is, in a moment, you're going to go down to the computer lab and you're going to work through an activity called the cell membrane game. All right, I'm going to try to pull up my camera here on my iPad so that you can see. There we go. So this is your Canvas page today. Sorry for the constant focusing and refocusing. But you'll see down underneath number 3, play the plasma membrane game. There's a link there out to Bioman Bio. So I just want to show you, when you get down to the computer lab, please make sure that you're using Chrome when you get down there, not Internet Explorer, not Firefox. Usually Firefox doesn't have too many glitches, but Internet Explorer is just terrible. So be sure to use Chrome. Log in here to Canvas and then click on this link and it'll take you out to the Bioman Bio site. And this cell defense game is what you're going to be playing today, the plasma membrane. So you just click on Start a New Game, press the space bar, click to continue. And I just want to show you there's a lot of different tools here that are going to be really great sort of resources for you as you're working through this particular chapter and learning about the cell membrane. So be sure to, you can come back here to this Canvas page anytime and go through any of these other links that you have. Today, we're going to be right here at Build a Membrane. When you're done with the plasma membrane game, you can also click on this link, Membrane Structure Challenge, and it's sort of like a little quick quiz for the cell membrane. Really great practice for, let's say, an upcoming quiz on the plasma membrane and cell transport. Okay, so we're going to start with Build a Membrane, and notice every single screen has its own set of information. So you're going to need to read through each screen carefully and compare it to the worksheet that I've given you. If you click through them too quickly, you may miss some of the information that needs to be written down on your worksheet. So be very careful, because there is no back button on this particular game. Okay, so if you mess up, you might have to start over all over again. Okay? All right, so we should be ready for heading down to the computer lab. Make sure that you have all of your materials, your 2 handouts, including your homework, and all of your belongings, because the sub is going to dismiss you from the computer lab today. All right?